My sermon is entitled, Bringing Wild Things and Angels Together. The scripture reading is from Mark chapter 1. Let me read it to you. The Spirit immediately drove him, Jesus, out into the wilderness. And as he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tempted by Satan, he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. Mark includes something in his account of Jesus' temptation that no other gospel records. It says he was with the wild animals. That's nowhere else in any of the gospels, only in Mark. And if you read commentaries and ask, why did Mark put that in? They come up with three suggestions. And I'll tell you what they are. You don't have to choose. You can choose all three or two or one, whichever one appeals to you the most. The first is that it has to do with geography. You know, Jesus was out in the wilderness. Where? Where is the wilderness? Well, it's out where there's wild animals. That's where the wilderness is. Oh, that far out. Wow. He was in a dangerous place. So, geography. The second one is theological. And that is that Jesus was tempted not in the Garden of Eden where all the animals were nice and friendly or in a good life. He was tempted where it's rough and tough and hard, kind of some of the places where you are tempted. So theological. But there's a third, and I like the third one. The third is that Mark is telling us, is hinting to us a theme. It is the thematic reason. Mark is telling you, this Jesus loves to go where wild creatures are, and he brings them into fellowship with angels. And I like that. I like that. In fact, well, let me tell you a little bit. Over the last 10, 15, 20 years, I did about 15 years ago or something like that, I did a master's in leadership at Andrews and became interested in what makes a good leader and moved from there to what makes good organizations, outstanding organizations, and then outstanding churches. And I moved from there to begin to look at the core values of organizations and people. And of course, from there I began to look at the core values of Jesus' life. What makes Jesus so outstanding? And the thing that struck me is that there are things that Jesus does that we don't do. Jesus, we don't want to be like that. And the church is so often, and individuals within the church are so often unlike Jesus that you wonder, where's the dissonance? Why that dissonance is there? About 2 years ago, I collected a bunch of notes and sent them to the editor of the Stanborough Press in Britain there and said, do you think there's a possibility of some sort of little book come out of these notes? Well, a year later, I hadn't heard anything back, so I thought, well, that was a waste of time, and obviously he didn't think that was worth thinking about. And then, about a year ago, I got an email from him which just said, Lou, we're publishing your book next week. And I went, what? What book? Which book? And I rang him up and said, what are you talking about? He said, the book that you sent me. We read it, we like it, and we're going to publish it. I said, it's not ready. It's just a draft of some ideas that I'd thrown in. He says, no, we like it. It's published. And on the basis of that little book, we got an invite from Brendan Pratt to come and do some presentations next week at the pastors' meeting. So that's part of the reason why we're here this time of the year. Besides, after that, enjoying our holiday. Well, we're on permanent holiday. We're retired, so life is great. So I look at the stories of Jesus with that question. What do you like, Jesus? What kind of person are you? And Mark has this theme. He loves taking the wild and angels and putting them together. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, there's only 2 slides, that one and this one. But if you go to the Gospel of Mark and begin from the first story, there's introduction before verse 21, Jesus' baptism, the wilderness, his disciples, and then he goes straight into the demon-possessed man in the synagogue. And from there, the leper who asks for healing. In each of these stories, Nothing comes between Jesus and the person in need. The demon-possessed man, he kind of busts up a church service to help this man. No church service comes between him and a man in need. And then he comes to the leper, and, practices you don't... Thank you. Practices you stay away from lepers. You distance yourself, whatever you do, you don't touch them. But nothing comes between Jesus and reaching people who are lost. Nothing. And you know the story. He reaches out and touches the man. And then we come to the call of Matthew Levi, the tax collector. And again, church protocol is you do not mix with tax collectors. This is like befriending a mafia person, making a good friend of a mafia boss. You don't do that. But for Jesus, nothing comes between him and reaching a lost person. Each of these stories is a sermon on its own, but I'm trying to give you an overview. And then from the call of Matthew, he goes to Matthew's house, and there's this party of tax collectors and sinners. Now, a few years ago, I read a book called The Definition of Sinners in the New Testament. And the book concluded that the word sinners puts the bad people in, the prostitutes, the drug addicts, the drug dealers, everybody in that bracket. They're the really bad people. So when Jesus goes to this party, it is not a church potluck party. This is a wild rave type party, and bad people are there. And I won't go into that. Maybe another time I can preach on that topic. But again, church protocol is you don't do that. We worked for some years in a town called Middlesbrough in England. And to drive to the church was in a very rough area. We had all sorts of adventures there. All the windows were steel bars, and there was one Sabbath when a bunch of kids actually burst into the church while we were all sitting there. They rushed up and grabbed the offering plate and were running out the church, and the deacons had to dive and tackle them and hold them down, take the money off. It was that kind of area. All right, it was broken into a number of times. Very rough area. But on the way to church, there was a wall about this high where, shall I call, the ladies of the night would sit on the wall. And every time I went to prayer meeting, I would drive past these ladies and think, I really ought to stop the car and go sit on the wall. But I never did, because I knew that the church members also drove past that wall, and they would sit there and say, Lou, what are you doing? And because church protocol is you don't do that. Jesus lets nothing stop him from reaching lost people. Nothing. He's in the business of bringing wild and angels into fellowship. And then in the sequence of stories, there's these two stories of conflict with the Pharisees. Now they are ominous, because Mark is flagging up Jesus' core value of reaching lost people has got a problem with the church. Fasting. These are adult people, these Pharisees, and for them, there's a concern about fasting. Come on, guys. That's your top priority? There are lost people out there that Jesus is desperate to reach, and you are concerned about fasting. And there's another story, I think it's in Luke, where it says the Pharisees came down from Jerusalem to Galilee to talk to Jesus about why his disciples weren't washing their hands before eating. Come on. They must have walked for a couple of days to come down and talk about washing their hands before meals. Is that their top priority? Part of my reading and looking at the values of individuals and the values of Christ compared to the values of the church has been collecting stories, outstanding stories of amazing grace from church members to people. And we have amazing people in our congregations. We also have horrendous stories about how some people have been treated in churches that literally drove them away. They don't want to come back, not to this church again. And for me, the challenge is, what are our top values? Maybe I can tell you a quick story. A friend of mine, who's a pastor in the States, was visiting us in Scotland. We were living there at the time. And he told me this story. He said, Lou, I have a son. He's a teenager, grew up in the church, but when he became a teenager, he left home, went away, and he got a job somewhere, but he left church as well, never came back. In fact, he didn't want anything to do with me. He lived in this town. We didn't have his address, so all we had was his email. But he said, I was pastoring a church at that time, but he said, eventually I became a conference director, and I had the opportunity to travel. And I got the opportunity to travel to this church in the town where I knew my son was. So I emailed him and said, son, I'm going to be preaching at the church this Sabbath. Is there any chance that you might come to church? Now, he didn't hear back, so he went to church, and that Sabbath school, he was there in Sabbath school, and he said his neck was getting sore because every time the door opened, he'd look back to see if it was his son, you know. He didn't come during Sabbath school. During the service time, he said he was up on the platform, and he said in this particular church, there was glass windows all on one side, which you could see the car park. So he's sitting there, and he's watching the car park for his son. Doesn't come. And now he stands up to preach, and he's introducing himself when he sees a car pull up, and out of the car gets his son and a young lady. And his heart goes, my boy has come to church. And he said, Lou, I'd prepared the sermon not for the church. I'd prepared the sermon for my son. So I see them walk around. Then I lose sight of them because they've gone around to the front of the church to come in. And after a little while, he said, Lou, I was actually extending my introduction about what I did and stuff like that, so I'd give them time to get in because I wanted them to hear the sermon. And he said, then I see them walk back and get in the car and drive off. And he said, Lou, I didn't know what to think. Had they come just to tell someone that they couldn't come? Or what? So he said, I preached the sermon, finished it, then at the end, when we went out, I hurried down the aisle, I went to the front door, and I said to the deacon, did you see a young couple come in? Just before the sermon began. And the deacon says, oh, I saw them all right. Did you see the length of her skirt? I told the young lady, if you want to attend church here, you go home and get dressed properly. And my pastor friend said, Lou, I didn't know whether to cry or to punch him. Now you think about those values. Actually, dress standards are an important value. There's nothing wrong with dressing properly coming. In fact, I think it's a good thing to wear a tie to come to church, sir. But when it comes between Christ and a lost person, the value is misplaced. It's in the wrong place. Am I making sense? There's nothing wrong with being a vegan. I'm a vegan. But when you thrust it upon people and say, you've got to be a vegan too, you before you can become an Adventist, you're pushing them away from Christ instead of having to come to Christ. And values become things that are, you've got to learn to rank your values. We worked for some time in Egypt, as I mentioned. And one of the things that I learned very quickly, as I said, vegan, and I'd go to little villages in Upper Egypt, and I'd look at the food and think, oh boy, today I have to eat meat. Or if I had a visitor with me, I would give them this little health quiz. Which is healthier, water or Coca-Cola? The answer is, was what? Did you say Coca-Cola? Woo! If you're in Egypt and there's a jug of water there on the table and there's a Coca-Cola, you take the Coca-Cola. It is healthier for you than the water. And you learn that your principle is not actually, I drink water. The principle is, I choose the best. And that's a different value than I drink water. Well, I'm kind of drifting a little bit with this topic because I'm passionate about it, but here's the Pharisees, this little warning. While Jesus is passionate about reaching people, the Pharisees are passionate about fasting. And there's a dissonance there. Why aren't they passionate about lost people? Why are the Pharisees saying to Jesus or to his disciples, why is your master eating with publicans and sinners? Why are they even asking that question? And then there's this Sabbath behavior thing in the cornfield. Wow. For them, it's a top priority. You don't rub wheat in your hand. Just a top priority. And they're just looking at, he's rubbing wheat with his hands. This is wrong. It's not bad Sabbath behavior. Instead of, how can we make Sabbath just a pleasure for people? Earlier, back in chapter 1, after Jesus cast the demon out of the man, he goes home to Peter's house and he heals Peter's mother-in-law. You remember the story? And then there's this blank. Nothing happens all Sabbath afternoon until it says at sunset, the whole town came to the door to be healed. What? What is it about Sabbath that people are not allowed to come to Jesus until after sunset? Is it possible that we in our value systems, and that little hint about the Sabbath, nobody being healed on Sabbath, is going to end this passage or this section in Mark chapter 3, 1 to 6, is a passage about Jesus healing a man with a withered hand on Sabbath. So we kind of come full circle, but we're going to encounter the problem in the church of Sabbath is this is what we do, or we do not welcome this kind of behavior of nothing stops me from reaching people in need. But it's Jesus' core value, or one of his core values. Well, then we come down to this last story. And I said it's a kind of a passage, a section, because verse 6 is going to end with the decision to kill Jesus. We have met this man who's passionate about people, but the church says, we don't do that here. And we're going to kill you for disturbing our Sabbath service. He's gone to church, and there's a man with a withered hand, and Jesus gets up and heals him. They look, and the suggestion is they have set Jesus up. They've stuck this man right close so Jesus can see him, and they know Jesus is going to respond, and Jesus responds and heals the man, and they go out and say, we're going to kill you for that. You have disturbed our Sabbath service. I preached on this passage once, and I remember a lady coming to me at the end of the service, and she said, Lou, couldn't Jesus have said to the man, where do you live? I'll come and see you after sunset. Or this afternoon. Why couldn't Jesus do that? Or couldn't Jesus have said, look, I've said a prayer for you, and by the time you get home, he'll be well. Like he's done, with the centurion's servant. And at first it threw me. Why did Jesus disturb the service and the order of service and what was happening in church? Why couldn't he just say, look, I'll see you later. I'll fix it, don't worry. And then it hit me. Jesus would say to that lady, you mean you want me to change my core value? You want me to put church services before helping people? No way. My core value is to meet people's needs, bring wild things and angels into fellowship. Service is not my core value. And in another passage when they talks about the Matthew Levi, Jesus says to the Pharisees, go and learn what it means, and I want mercy, not sacrifice. Kindness comes before church service. Sometimes it's hard to take, particularly if the pastor has prepared a brilliant sermon and nobody turns up because they've all gone out helping their neighbor. Come on, guys, come to church. You're supposed to come listen to me. That's the tradition. But it's a tradition that turns the core values the wrong way up. And we need to understand what are the core values of the life of Christ and say, those are my core values. And they go above everything else we have learned to do. I kind of made up a story about a girl called Mary. Mary wakes up one Saturday morning in her flat. She doesn't know she got to bed that night. She vaguely remembers a party. She's got vomit in her hair. She reeks of tobacco and alcohol, and she just feels sick. She gets up and she goes for a walk. It's a lovely Saturday morning. And she's thinking about suicide. And as she's walking along, she comes across a building and she looks up. It's a church, and it says Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it's open. It's Saturday morning. She says, I wonder if somebody here will help me. So she steps into the door. Now, several things could happen. The deacon could say to her, Lady, you smell. Go home and get washed. Have you seen the length of her skirt? Go home and get dressed properly. Have you been smoking? Have you been doing drugs? What are you doing here? Several things like that could happen. Now, you might say, Lou, come on, that's not going to happen. They do happen. And that's what makes me so angry when I look at my church and say, we represent Christ and his values, not the values of your mum or dad, loving as they were and good intentioned as they were. We have to learn to be Christ people and learn his core values. Pastor friend of mine, as I say, I collect stories. Pastor friend of mine and his wife and he was a division worker. So, he's up there. He's just retired. But he told me the story. He and his wife are on holiday in a particular country. Won't name the country. But he said on the Friday they searched for a church. And they couldn't find an Adventist church anywhere. So they said, well, don't worry. We'll take our Sabbath school lesson. We'll go out to one of the beaches and just relax and sit by the beach all day. So he said he and his wife got up. They just in slacks and probably looked like they were going to Bega church. And casual clothes and sandals, and they are out walking to find them along the beaches. And as they're going along, they see people with Bible under their hands, nice clothes on, and they're going resolutely in one direction. And he says to his wife, they've got to be Adventists. Let's follow them. So they follow these people down the street, around a corner, and sure enough, there's a lovely Seventh-day Adventist church. So he said, wow, we can go to church now. So they're walking up the steps of the church when the deacon steps out and says, where do you think you're going? And he said, we come to church. He says, you can't come to church dressed like this. And he started to explain, well, we're on holiday and we hadn't thought we'd find a church. And when he was saved by another man who stepped out and said, hey, I've seen you. You are Pastor so-and-so. I've seen videos of your training programs. He said, yeah, that's me. Whew. And the deacon says, you're still not coming to our church dressed like that. Where's the core value? Nothing stands between Jesus and bringing a person into fellowship with angels. Nothing. Not dress, not smell, not look, not background, not color, not anything. What are your core values? Let me finish with a story. I hope you don't know the story, but it's such a great story that I'm shocked that everybody doesn't know it, but I hope, let's see. It's a story about a guy called Bob who's a Hell's Angel. Have you heard of Hell's Angels? Good. All right, this guy called Bob has torn his leather jacket, and he decides to get it mended. So he goes and finds a shop that deals with leather jackets, and he goes in. But as he's walking in, and there's this girl behind the counter who just is stunning to him. He's, wow. And instead of talking about the jacket, he goes straight up to him and says, hey, would you come out with me? And she goes, get away. She says, I don't even know you. Go away. And he says, oh, and then he remembers what, be civil. And he says, okay, hey, I'm sorry. I actually came because my jacket's torn, but wow, you're so beautiful. I'm sorry, the jacket's torn. Can you fix my jacket? And she says, yeah, we can fix your jacket. So he says, okay. So he leaves the jacket. She says, come back in a couple of days and whatever. And anyway, he goes. And then a couple of days later, he comes back to get the jacket. And he's still flipped on this girl. These are non-Christian people, all right? So he goes into the shop again. And he gets the jacket and he said, thank you very much. He said, I want to apologize for the way I talked to you last time I came. He said, I was just struck how beautiful you are. Could I make up for it by taking you out for a meal? And so she says, well, all right. So they go out for a meal, and then they keep going out for meals, and they start going steady, and next thing they're living together, and she's become part of the pack, and life is just honky-dory for Bob. And so one Friday night, they're lying in bed, and Mary says to Bob, Bob, I want to go to church tomorrow. And Bob says, what? I don't do church. What do you mean church? We don't do church. I wouldn't be dead in a church. I'm not going to any church. She says, Bob, I don't know why, but I just want to go to church. He says, no, Mary, we don't do church. I hate church. Christian people, I don't want anything to do with them. She says, Bob, I'll tell you what, I feel so strongly about this that if we don't go to church, I'm going to go myself somewhere to go to church, and you can, maybe we're done. And Bob loves this girl so much. He says, no, okay, we'll go to church. But he said, you're wrong. You're wrong. She says, why? Because he said, tomorrow's Saturday. There's no churches on Saturday. They're on Sunday. She says, there has to be a church on Saturday. Why? She says, when I was a little girl, there were some neighbors, the loveliest people I can remember in my life, who always went to church on Saturday. Well, what church did they go to? He says, I don't know, but they always went to church. So he said, okay, I'll prove it to you there's no such church. He gets the phone book and he turns us to churches and he's thumbing through them. A, B, C, and he goes through these churches. He says, look, Sunday, 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 Sunday. He's flipping through the book and it's a Sunday. Says, hey, here's one that's Saturday. She says, what church is it? He said, it's a Seventh-day Adventist. She goes, that's where we're going to church tomorrow. So, okay. They said, okay, it starts at 10 o'clock. So they go up on the motorbike and Bob's not afraid of anybody. So Bob stomps into church and sits in the front row, right where Barry's sitting. Okay, and Mary's sitting next to him. And they're in Sabbath school. They listen to the pastor happens to be taking the Sabbath school lesson. And the pastor stands up and says, okay, our lesson is on this topic. And Bob says, excuse me, I'm not interested in that topic. I want to know why there's evil if there's a good God. That's what I want to hear discussed. And the pastor telling the story says that he was impressed on the Friday night he was preparing the Sabbath school lesson to change the topic to the topic of why evil. He said, I don't know why, but it just stuck and I was ready. So he said, friends, is it okay if we address this topic for our friend? And the church said, yep. So he does. He addresses the topic. And at the end of the Sabbath school, Bob and Mary get up and leave. And they go home. Next Friday night, they're lying in bed. And Mary says, Bob, I'd like to go to church again tomorrow. He says, Mary, once is enough. I hate churches. I don't want anything. Mary says, Bob, was there something wrong? A church? They were all right. They were a friendly bunch. And did the pastor not do what you asked him to do? Yeah. And his answers, well, it was reasonable, but not that I agree, but it's okay. Well, let's go to church then. And Bob says, Mary, do we have to? Yes, I want to go to church. So they get up and they go to church. And again, Saturday, 10 o'clock, they're sitting in the front row and listen to the story and then the Sabbath school, and then they go home again. Next Friday night, I won't prolong the story, same thing happens, and they get up and they go to church, and then they're walking out, and as they're walking out, the deacon says, really nice to have you again the last 3 weeks. Why don't you come to church? And Bob looks at him and says, we just did come to church. What do you mean, why don't we come to church? No, you came to Sabbath school. Church begins in about 15 minutes. You're welcome to come to church. And Bob goes, the crazy people, and they leave. Church is church as far as Bob is concerned. And they go home, and Friday night, Mary says, Bob, and Bob says, I know, you want to go to church. She says, let's go to church. All right, but he says, I'll make a deal with you, just once. Just once? She said, Bob, I can't make that deal. I don't care about next week. I just feel tonight I want to go tomorrow. All right. So they go to church this time, 11 o'clock, and they turn up at church, and Bob sits in the front row again. And the pastor preaches on, of all topics, tithing. And Mary senses that Bob is really niggled. And as soon as church is over, he's out. And Mary comes out and he says, I told you I don't want anything to do with church. All they want is your money. Didn't you hear it? They want 10% of your money. That's all they're interested in. And this is the first church service I've been to, and that's what they want, money. So they go home, and next Friday night, Mary says, Bob, I'd like to rethink about church. He says, Mary, I told you. They only wanted your money. Bob, he didn't say that. What did he say? He talked about making a relationship with God. And he said that if you honor God with 10%, with your tithe, God will honor you and give you increase. Didn't he say that? And Bob says, okay, but it doesn't happen, Mary. It's not life. Life is not like that. She says, but that's what the pastor said. Yeah. She said, well, why don't you try it? He says, you want me to give a tenth of my income to church? Yes, she said. That's crazy, Mary. And she said, well, let's just try it. So they go to church. Offering plate comes around, and Bob stands up in front of the congregation and says, listen, folks, last week, your pastor said that if I give my offering in, God will bless me. I am giving $15 in this plate, and if God doesn't bless me more than $15 this week, you're never seeing me again. And he throws it in the plate, sits down. They go home. Nothing happens. Friday night, Mary says, Bob, let's go to church again. Bob says, no, Mary, I did this $15 and nothing happened. Nothing happened, Mary. No change, nothing happened. She said, well, a deal is a deal, isn't it? He said, what do you mean? He said, the pastor said 10%. Did you give 10%? No. Well, if God's deal is 10% and I'll give you more, then it's a deal. I mean, you shortchanged God, so why should he bless you? And Bob goes, this is crazy, Barry. Okay, let's go to church. I'll give 15%. So they go and give, I think it was, if I remember right, about $25. He stands up again and says, guys, last week I didn't give a tithe. This week, this is the tithe, all right? I'm paying my 10%. You're not seeing me next week if I don't get more back. So he goes home. The next Friday night, Bob says to Mary, Mary, let's go to church tomorrow. She says, why? He said, it works. I have never done so well as I've done this week. I really did more than $25. We're going to church. This deal works. So they go to church and they sit there, and Bob stands up and says, church, guess what? Tithing works. I'm going to put $35 in this week, and I want to see what happens. Next week, Bob is bringing Mary to church, and each time he stands up and says, look, it's $40. Now it's $50. And the next Sabbath, like he said, I'm giving $60 this week to church, to tithe. And then somebody says, Bob, what's your business? Bob says, I sell drugs. What do you mean, what's my business? Okay, it's a good story. Oh, let me finish it. The pastor was in the congregation when Bob said that. And as Bob is leaving, pastor walks beside him and says, could we have a little chat? And it begins a series of Bible studies. And one Sabbath, pastor stands up in church and says, church, today church is going to be very unusual. The first thing we're doing in Sabbath school, we're not having Sabbath school, we're having a wedding service. Bob and Mary are getting married this morning. We've arranged everything, and there's the wedding services right now. And then after the wedding service is a baptism. And Bob and Mary are being baptized this morning. And after the wedding, after the baptism, we're going to have a potluck lunch. By the way, there's no offering today. No offering. Because at the potluck lunch, there's going to be a bucket. And I want each of you to put everything you can into that bucket, because Bob and Mary have broken their ties with drug dealing, and they are not safe for them to live any longer in the city. So they are moving, we've arranged it, moving to another city completely. The pastor in that town has agreed to meet them, found them a place to live, and they're going to live there and start a new life as Seventh-day Adventists. And I remember reading the story, and it said, if one day you travel and you meet a couple, a big guy with a big bushy beard, he and his wife are teaching the children's Sabbath school, you're probably meeting Bob and Mary. It's a lovely story. But here's the question I want to leave you with. Why would God honor the tithe of a drug dealer. Can I suggest that it's because he's still in the process of bringing wild people together with angels? And nothing, no protocol, no what we think is right or wrong, comes between him and winning lost people. Amen.